if you're someone who struggles with chronic inflammation or chronic autoimmune flares or chronic pain, then this video may be very useful in helping you understand your case, especially if you're someone who has, quote, seen every doctor and done every test and tried every medication or whatever option is available. Even if you've tried every natural anti-inflammatory and seen every naturopath and chiropractor and functional medicine doctor around you, this may turn over one rock that you haven't looked under for you today. So the title is Why Am I Still Inflamed? Where to Look When All Anti-Inflammatory Strategies Have Failed. And so I want to help you understand this process with a case study. And so this is a case study of a patient from my office, a 38-year-old male at the time that he presented, which was a couple of years ago now, but he had leading up to coming in, he had a four-year history of chronic pain and joint stiffness. And he had pain in multiple joints, the shoulders, the hands, the knees, but the one that hurt his quality of life the most was the shoulder pain, because he would wake every morning with it and it would wake him every night. So sleeping on his side, his shoulder pain would wake him up, and he was a side sleeper, so that made it difficult. And he had seen orthopedists, he had seen, physical therapists, he'd seen his general practitioner, and essentially all they could do was give him meloxicam daily. And meloxicam is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, or an NSAID. And that helped take the edge off a little bit, but it wasn't doing anything to solve the problem. And so at 38 years old, this person loved to play golf and, wants to continue playing golf, and the pain would interfere with his range of motion and his enjoyment of being out there. So, working him up, it's like, okay, this should be a slam dunk case. Let's go find inflammation and put that out. Let's go find where his fire extinguishers are low and recharge those, and he should be good to go. And so the results here on the page are the initial testing. So let me just mark it up a little bit for you so we can walk through it. So you can see here on the viewer's left, we ran an essential fatty acid panel. And what this does is it looks at the ratio of your omega-6 to your omega-3 levels. And it's important to understand that omega-6s are pro-inflammatory and omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. Now, both are called essential fatty acids. That word essential means that we cannot make them inside our body. We have to get them through our diet. We have to consume them, okay? So we can't make 6s or 3s. So as humans, we would be tempted to say, well, 6s are pro-inflammatory, so those are bad, and 3s are anti-inflammatory, so those are good. Neither is good or bad. They're both essential. We need them both because we can't make them. And in a balanced ratio, right, if we draw a seesaw here with a 6 over here and a 3 over here, that's ideal. We have balanced amounts of both, so that if we need inflammation, we can ramp up over here and kill that infection or heal that wound. And then when we've killed that infection or healed that wound, we want to raise the 3s, the anti-inflammatories, to put that fire out, right? So they're both necessary. They're not good or bad until we get something like this, right? When we get an imbalance, then that could be bad. And that could be bad whether the 6s are high and you're very inflamed and in pain, or if the 3s are high, you're so anti-inflammatory that you could still be inflamed because you're chronically infected, right? Because you're putting out, you're spraying down your immune system when it's trying to inflame against an infection. That would be a negative as well. So if we look at this case, this person had lab low omega-3 ratio, okay, or excuse me, total omega-3s. And you can see here that the lab marks this as a high relative risk for cardiovascular disease. Why? Well, because omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. They promote their blood thinning, so anti-clotting. They promote healthy cardiovascular system, healthy brain, all kinds of things. So heart disease, stroke, blood pressure, all associated, or your risk is associated with your omega-3 level. So yes, he was at high risk for cardiovascular disease if you're just going by categorization here, but more relevant to his case, because I wasn't concerned about cardiovascular risk in his case. I ran this because I wanted to know about the pain, okay? And so remember, if 3s are one of our strongest anti-inflammatories, one of our best fire extinguishers, if he's lab low there, then he could be in pain because he doesn't have enough fire extinguisher, right? That could be one reason. He doesn't have enough anti-inflammatories, so he's going to be biased toward a pro-inflammatory internal environment. So his total 3s are too low. EPA here, eicosapentaenoic acid, EPA, that's the most anti-inflammatory of the omega-3s, and that's functionally low. He wasn't lab low. Here's normal range over here. So he wouldn't be lab low until he was less than 0.2, but it goes all the way up to 2.3. And in our society, with all the chronic disease and things we see, I don't even mind people being lab high sometimes, depending on the context of the case. So he could definitely do better there. His DPA looked okay. That has to do with vascular health. And then the DHA, again, was borderline lab low, okay? And DHA is the main omega-3 for the central nervous system, for the brain. And so cognition, brain fog, anxiety, depression, maybe central nervous system inflammation, all that stuff could be at play, okay? And so that might matter in his case because sometimes chronic pain is due to what's called central sensitization, which is where the brain is inflamed in a chronic way, and it basically becomes a learned habit where the inflammation just begets more inflammation. So if we could increase his central nervous system omega-3 levels, maybe we could break that cycle if that's what's going on. So just from his omega-6 to 3 ratio, we can see that he was biased towards a pro-inflammatory phenotype, okay? Then we look at other markers. Over here, we can see C-reactive protein. His high sensitivity C-reactive protein here is lab high at 8.4. Optimal is less than 1. Okay, this is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease as well. And anything greater than 3 is places you in the highest relative risk category for a cardiovascular standpoint. So, there's high risk, there's high risk. It's not looking good if you're just treating paper. It's not looking good for this guy's heart. But when you look at the actual patient, he was of no heart risk, okay? So this CRP means more than just heart. This means systemic inflammation. Not only could your heart be inflamed, but your whole body could. So the heart inflammation isn't relevant in his case, but the body inflammation is, and maybe driving the chronic pain and joint stiffness. So we want this to come down because when I see an 8.4, I'm like, okay, if we can get this less than 1, I bet you're feeling good. I bet you're waking up without pain. I bet you're sleeping without pain. I bet you're smacking hole-in-ones and making the tour, right? Not really, but we want to see this down below 1. His uric acid is lab high. Okay, uric acid is, if you've ever heard of gout, okay, uric acid is what's behind the pain and symptoms involved with gout. High uric acid drives gout. He did not have gout, but he had high uric acid. Well, even in the absence of gout, uric acid suggests high intracellular inflammation through what's called inflammasome activation. So we don't have to go deep into that today, but you can search that on my channel and see other discussions of that. Needless to say, this is saying inside his cells are inflamed. This is saying outside his cells are inflamed. His TGF beta is lab high at 8,200. This marker, again, is inflammation and oxidative stress, fire and rust, okay? This will inhibit antiviral defenses. This will decrease your glutathione levels. Glutathione is your body's master antioxidant. And helps put out fires. So again, this being high is working against you in terms of being pain-free. So we want to see that down below 2,000 ideally. And then his vitamin D is 31. 29 would have been lab low. So his vitamin D essentially was deficient, and vitamin D should be, is one of our best anti-inflammatories, helps balance the immune system, helps keep barriers tight, not leaky, is antiviral, functions in dopamine signaling. Vitamin D does all kinds of things for us. So again, relevant to his case, we want its anti-inflammatory aspect. We want it to put out that chronic pain fire. So we ran this testing, and again, I say, okay, this guy's got chronic pain. This should be a slam dunk. We get these numbers down, or we get these numbers, sorry, we get these numbers down, and this one up, and he should be feeling good. So we create a plan specific to him, move forward with that, and let's see what happens there. So if we jump forward to the 6-week test, oh boy, that's ugly. Hold on one second. Let's get rid of those. All right, jump forward to the 6-week testing. So 6 weeks later, we rerun the labs, okay? And we see significant change. We didn't rerun the fatty acids because that's a fairly expensive test. So I do that at 12-week intervals, or in this case, I did. So CRPs relatively, these are, other than the TGF-beta, the D and the CRP are routine and inexpensive, so we can track those. Plus, they were high on him, high and low, so we definitely want to track those. So at the 6-week mark, his CRP is 8.1 still. Okay, that's really not changed. It was 8.4 before, so that's not really a significant change, and that makes me wonder, why hasn't that gone down, especially in the face of TGF-beta and vitamin D. TGF-beta was 8,000 before, 8,200. So if we pop up here, 8,200. Now at 6 weeks, it's dropped to 4,900. So a big reduction there. That's a big change. We're dumping inflammation along this pathway. Okay. And then vitamin D has increased big time. Big time. Remember, it was 31. Our goal was 70. He's at 69. So that's a huge improvement there. Essentially mission accomplished. And so from the 6-week point, we then want to decrease vitamin D dose and try and dial in or titrate what a maintenance dose would be for him. When we retest at 12 weeks, if we reduce his dose and the retest at 12 weeks of D is still around 70, then we know that whatever that reduced dose was is sufficient for a maintenance dose for him. If we reduce his dose and at 12 weeks the vitamin D has dropped significantly, say down in the low 50 or 40s, then we know whatever we were trying for the maintenance dose wasn't enough, and we'll have to increase from there. So this test was to, our midterm exam, to check in and say, is what we're doing working? And overall, the answer is yes, but that C-reactive protein, essentially unchanged, makes me wonder, okay, is there something deeper in this case? So I just flagged it. I don't necessarily change much there because we're seeing good changes elsewhere. Sometimes some numbers lag behind, but I marked it in my head and I said at 12 weeks, if that's not significantly better, we need to do some further investigation there. So if we jump to the 12-week test, here we are, and let's look at the numbers from now. So 12 weeks ago, the omega-3 test was lab low. It was 3.2. Now it's robust at 12.4. And remember, he had a high heart risk before. Now he's the lowest relative risk category. Okay, so by increasing his total omega-3 levels, we've drastically reduced his cardiovascular risk. That's good, but again, we weren't worried about his cardiovascular risk. We wanted to raise these levels because we wanted to put fires out. We wanted his fire extinguishers to be better, okay? And so we did that. Remember, this total is made up of these three here, bang, bang, bang. So remember, the EPA was 0.7 before. Now it's lab high at 5.9. Okay, so we definitely got those levels up. And I said earlier, I don't mind them being lab high sometimes. You know, I don't mind lab high in the 3s. I don't necessarily want it to be a 6. But again, you dose somebody and you retest and you say how'd they do. Different people absorb things at different rates. So he absorbed them and well to the point that he went from 0.7 to 6. So he almost went, 10x with it. Other people, you might give the same dose and they don't absorb it well, and they go from 0.7 to like 1.4, So now that we saw how he did, we can take him off omega-3s for a bit, let it come back down, retest, and then work on a maintenance dose. But regardless, we were successful in raising his anti-inflammatory capacity from an EPA standard and DHA as well. Remember, DHA was the brain one, and that was 1.6 before. Now we're robustly in the normal range, the optimal range at 4.7. So we've improved the omega-3 that's most important in the brain and for cognition. And so he's thinking more clearly, and that does provide anti-inflammatory benefit as well, just not as strongly as the EPA does. So we won on this front. Then we go over to TGF beta, and bam, TGF beta was 8,200 initially, dropped to 4,900 at the 6 weeks, and now we're optimal at 1,024. Okay, our goal, I said I wanted to be less than 2,000. We're right at 1,024 there, so we're good. We like that number. He's not driving inflammation and rust through these pathways anymore, so that's excellent. His vitamin D was, remember, 31, went up to 69, 70 was our goal. We decreased his dose to figure out what's a maintenance dose for him. And now on this retest 6 weeks later, or at the 12-week mark, it went from 69 to 44. So we know one of two things, and maybe both. One, maybe the maintenance dose is too small, okay? Because, hey, all else held the same. If we decrease dose and the level drops, then it's not enough to keep him where he was, right? And or two, maybe he was more inflamed or had more fires to put out, or had more need for D over the last 6-week interval. So we'll just say D need, okay? And so it may be a combination of both, but look, if we look at the other inflammatory markers, those all, this went down and his anti-inflammatory capacity went up. So that would suggest that he wasn't actually more inflamed over this last 6-week interval, requiring him to metabolize through his D more quickly and driving it down, right? So the likelihood is that the maintenance dose wasn't enough to keep up with just, baseline everyday needs. So we just, we increased the dose from a day-to-day standpoint and retest at a different interval and say, okay, we went from X dose to Y dose as a maintenance dose, and this went back up. Okay, then that's what you need to stay at. Okay, so we're happy about these numbers changing, but now we're at 12 weeks and this CRP hasn't really changed much. Okay, it was 8.4, then it was 8.1, and now it's 7.7, call it. Okay, so that's not really a change, or it's not a change that I expect. I expect to see this less than 1. Okay, if if we're working with if we're working with the physiology that we typically see and we do things right, that should come down to less than 1. So remember, I flagged it at 6 weeks saying what's going on here. Well, now at 12 weeks, it hasn't really changed. So now I'm thinking, okay, there must be something unique about his case that's keeping this up. And one thing that can happen here is you could have genetic variants in the genes that code for C-reactive protein, or code for what C-reactive proteins represents, that are keeping this up, okay? So what does that mean? Let's dive a little deeper into that. So to dig deeper into why is he still inflamed on the CRP pathway, we want to go investigate his unique genetics and see, is there a genetic reason behind this? First, we want to understand how C-reactive protein is made, okay? So C-reactive protein is a protein, as you hear in the name, protein. And proteins are made in the liver. And so the liver makes proteins, and proteins serve a function. Well, what is C-reactive protein? If we go in reverse here, C-reactive protein is the inflammatory marker that we were following to understand his pain and his inflammatory levels. And he didn't have autoimmune disease, but in people with autoimmune disease, we can use CRP to understand your autoimmune disease and if you're in an autoimmune flare and what's going on immunologically with your disease. So for him, we're interested in his CRP wasn't going down and his pain wasn't changing significantly, even with the other changes in inflammatory markers. So we want to understand the CRP. Well, CRP is a surrogate marker for these three guys. And these three guys are interleukin-6, interleukin-1 beta, tumor necrosis factor alpha. Your head might be spinning. Don't worry about what those mean. Just think of them as the unhappy triad, okay? So the unhappy triad of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which basically you can think of as chemical messengers. When you're pumping these out, you're driving inflammation, okay? So these things are cytokines or inflammatory messengers that when they're elevated, trigger the liver to make C-reactive protein, which then helps us understand someone's pain, inflammation, autoimmunity. Well, these things are made by genes. Okay, so genes are like a blueprint for proteins to be made. Okay, so there's genes for TNF-alpha, there's genes for this, there's genes for IL-6. So it's possible that someone has a genetic variant where there's or what's called a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP for short. If you have SNPs in one or more of these genes, you could have a SNP or a variant that makes the gene function too little or function too much. Okay, so if you have a gain of function SNP or a gain of function variant in your genes for interleukin-6 and or TNF-alpha, you're going to be making more of those than is normal, okay, which will drive more liver production of C-reactive protein and more inflammation, more pain, more symptomatology, more autoimmune flare, okay? So I wanted to understand in this person, is the persistent CRP, even though we've done things that, typically would lower that, is his persistence here due to genetics? And we can look at that. How do we look at that? Quite easily. You've all probably heard of 23andMe, 23andMe.com. I don't make any money from them, but it's a very useful and inexpensive way to test your genes and figure this out on yourself. So 23andMe is marketed as an ancestry test. So you can go see, what's your ethnicity, what's your land of origin. And they claim to have health reports, but their health reports are useless. What's really helpful if you're working with a doctor who knows how to do it is you go run the 23andMe test. And once you've got your results, you will be able to download the raw data, which you can see right here. This is the raw data. It's a text file on you. And all of these RS numbers are different genes or different alleles that could be normal or could have variants. Okay, so here's the gene say, and here's your allele breakdown. Don't worry about it. I have other videos on it if you're interested. But this is the data that we want from the 23andMe test. You can get this data with just the cheapest one. You don't have to pay for the health reports one, which is always the higher level price test. Just go do the basic Ancestry 23andMe test. Once you get your results, download the raw data, and then your doctor can help you with it, okay? Right now, we're in January, and they're having a deal for $70 for this test. It's typically $99. So, if you're interested, go run it. But anyways, we can take this information, and then your doctor can go and plug it in to a program where we can actually get useful information from that SNP data. So here is what we want to get to. this is what I did with this patient, and here's the information we got. So remember, we were looking for SNPs involved in IL-6 and TNF-alpha as the drivers for C-reactive protein. So we get this person's genetics, which this is not the patient's genetics. This is just an example. But we got his genetics. I plugged them in where practitioners can take it. And look, we're looking at the interleukin-6 gene here, and we're looking at the TNF-alpha gene here. Okay, so the IL-6 gene, the risk variant. So if you have a CG result or a GG result, you are someone that is producing too much IL-6 or more IL-6 than is normal. And this patient had GG. So he has the mutation or the genetic variant in the IL-6 gene that may lead to higher expression of IL-6, okay? And then in the TNF-alpha gene, variants are AG or AA. This patient also has the mutation in TNF-alpha, okay, which may lead to higher expression of TNF-alpha. So not only does he have one, he has both variants, both genes. He has SNPs or variants or mutations that upregulate or are gain of function with these genes. That means he's going to produce more IL-6 and TNF-alpha, which will lead to more drive of this process, higher CRP, and higher risk of pain, inflammation, autoimmunity, or autoimmune flares. And so with this information, we then knew, okay, this helps explain why his CRP hasn't come down, even though all his other numbers have come down. And so we know that there's a genetic driver behind all of this. And so we can't change this patient's genes, right? You can't change your genes. You have the hand you were dealt. And so from there, what we can do is adjust our lifestyle and our clinical expectations for what is optimal, or what, what can you expect? What's the best you can expect to get, right? So for this patient, we knew, okay, we're not going to ever have your CRP below 1 likely, but if we can get it as low as possible, which in his case, the 7.7 is the lowest I've ever seen on him. We've continued to run labs on him and follow it, and it's never been below that. But as long as we keep the other markers optimal and keep his lifestyle dialed in, he's going to have the least amount of pain possible. And so, genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, right? So we can't change his genes, but we can deal with his lifestyle, which is his environment, and optimize all that we can control. And if that's his only 2 hiccups, then he's still going to live a pretty good life. Okay, it might mean he lives a life with some shoulder pain, but the shoulder pain can be less when those are the only 2 markers that are bad, as long as we keep all the other ones that we optimized, keep them optimal. Make sense? So I hope this was interesting to you all. And if you're out there and you're struggling with chronic pain, or you're struggling with chronic inflammation or autoimmune flares, and your doctors are kind of throwing their hands up in the air saying, we don't know, it's probably genetic, well, when they say that, typically it's kind of a cop out, like, I don't know, get out of here. They actually might be right. It might be genetic in your case, but the answer isn't to say it's probably genetic and just get you out the door. The answer would be to truly consider, well, maybe it is genetic. Let's investigate the SNPs related to that and find out whether or not it truly is. So if you're looking for help with that, obviously, I do that with my patients when necessary. And, you could find a doctor to help you do that as well.
Did that patient also change his diet?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we did for him what mattered in terms of all the lifestyle factors. So diet, physical activity, stress reduction, sleep hygiene, toxin avoidance, supplementation. Yeah. So he got to the point where he could play golf, no worries. It basically got down to just the sleeping. The overnight and the waking are the most difficult parts, but then you know, when we get him going, he's okay during the day and doesn't need the meloxicam. And for him, that's probably optimal because we can't change those genes. But also understanding that too, like he was happy just to know a why, right? Versus just, okay, I've seen everyone and no one even gave me an ultimate answer. You know, just having the, okay, this is a genes thing, and now I can have expectations that I can't change that, but it even reinforces that I need to continue to be consistent in these other things. Cool, I can do that, right? It's kind of like what I've never understood, but people who suffer forever and then they're told they have cancer and they're like, oh, phew. And it's like, wait, I said you have cancer, you know, like, why are you relieved? You know, but people want to have a name or a reason behind it. So this at least allows you to have some closure to some level.
John, a question. I'm guessing at one time in his life, he did not have pain, and triggered sometime. But genes did not change.
Right.
I think it's kind of obvious, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Basically, his lifestyle and combination of genes led him to the pain. That's how I am thinking of that. And what happened working with you, he reversed those lifestyle choices.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So matter has limitations, right? So you're right that he's born with these genes, right? And then there's so much, we all have some level of resilience or so much we can take. And then eventually there is some straw that breaks our camel's back, right? So when and what was his, I'm not sure, but it happened, right? And so at that point, based on the limitations of matter, sometimes you can correct things and get back to a non-pain level, and sometimes you can't. And so it's the same conversation. I've made a couple of videos on this. You could search on my channel. I titled them something like "Why You Can't Cheat with Autoimmune Disease," and essentially, you know, people will, with autoimmune disease or chronic pain, whatever it is, or just someone doing a Whole30 at a gym this month, right? They're going to do it. They're going to feel better. And what do? They go celebrate, right? With just one bite of a birthday cake or just one night of pizza. And because they know they'll probably feel worse tomorrow, but they assume they can get back to how they felt today. And that's not always the case, especially with autoimmune disease, because if you have antibodies involved that recognize a target, say your thyroid, and then you eat gluten, which looks a lot like is cross-reactive with thyroid, you have just that one bite of birthday cake and have the thyroid flare, and then you call me 2 weeks later and you're like, I had one bite of birthday cake 2 weeks ago and I'm still flaring and I'm doing everything that we've always done. Well, that one bite to those antibodies, that might cause what's called epitope spreading. So they used to recognize only one target, but now they recognize two targets, and we can't now eliminate that new line of cells that now recognize that new target, right? So we don't want to dangle that carrot to the immune system in an autoimmune standpoint, because you're not guaranteed to always go back to how you were. Does that make sense, Niraj?
Yeah, it does. It scares me, actually.
Yeah, it's we're not immortal, and choices have consequences. So like, it really, that one bite of cake or that pizza or that beer, it's really not worth it.
Like, I know this has to do with the genes, but like, it's like, you know how genes are passed down, and it's like, where did this even start? Is this something that just human evolution? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think like, where did this start? Like the mutations?
Like getting, like how some people have it in their genes, you know, like where it's not from their environment, but they were born with it, basically.
Yeah, I think it's just physiology, and biology. So over time, with each reproduction, you can lose integrity. So it's kind of like that, but think of the copy machine, right? So if you ever made a copy, the first copy of the original is nice, but the 100th copy is not as good, and the 1000th copy is even worse, right? So think of that as copying the genes and reproducing the genes. So over time, there are poorer copies, which can result in mutations, because now a little case A sometimes looks like an O, right? Or think of another analogous letter.
Yeah.
So it can be misinterpreted or misread, and now you have a genetic mutation. Or you have X genes, and now you're exposed to BPA in the environment, and that changes certain genes. Certain frogs who are in an environment with a bunch of BPA grow a third leg, or male frogs turn female, or like there's environmental consequences. So
Right.
These things happen. There's normal errors in biology over time that are supposed to be corrected, but biology isn't 100% efficient at that. And then there's what humans have done, to the world and the environment, and ultimately that can come back on us as well. So we can do our best with what we got,
Yeah.
So and that's why we can learn, and then we can take action, and then we can role model for our kids, because they're the actions speak louder than words, and that's true. And so our kids can watch a lot of commercials with a bunch of death in them, death foods and death products and all that, or we can role model as parents. No, we don't eat that, and no, we don't use that, and this is what we do, and this is how we live. And hopefully that's enough for them to pick it up and continue it once they're old enough to make their own choices. And then events like current events hopefully swing people too, to say, okay, there's got to be more than just pharmacology to keep me safe and healthy, because clearly the pharmacology isn't. So what do I need to do? If the only answer is drugs or surgery, well, what did humans do before we had that? We lived eons before we had that, so there's got to be a more fundamental way to be healthy.
Well, just tagging on what Jarrell said, is like, if somebody got their results back and it came back where it is genetic, that life is short, and someone would say, oh heck, I'm going to have that piece of pizza, or I'm going to treat myself to a bowl of ice cream in the summer, because there's nothing they can do.
Well, that's a choice everyone can make as an adult. But the short life that you have can be more or less painful, or more or less enjoyable, right? And so we've spoken on previous videos about the nerd term is morbidity compression, right? So we all have, say, 72 years or 77 years or 82 years, whatever you want it to be. And our choices determine whether in that 82, 62 are good and 20, are in pain and on a respirator and all that, or 77 are good and 5 are low quality, right? So essentially, they say that our healthcare is the best, and look at lifespan and all that. It's essentially the same it's the same quality of life. It's just you're living longer, poor quality, right? So on average, people get like 65 years of quality life, and then we might live a little bit longer than previous generations. But if you're living a little bit longer on a respirator, is that really worth it, right? So we want to compress morbidity by making the choices that promote health and quality of life, so that we're spending the least amount of time and resources and money on pain and poor quality at the end.
Well, it's just a little depressing, just a little bit, about, it's like you're doing all the things, you're eating, you're being disciplined and stuff like that, but if it's in the cards, it's in the cards, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, To an extent. So I've run enough of these to see. So you've heard of probably MTHFR genes or MTHFR mutations. So there's one that's really sexy, you know, in the blogosphere, MTHFR. Like I have the MTHFR mutation, and that mutation will can reduce the efficiency of the MTHFR gene because it requires folate. So if you're lacking folate, that mutation is more inefficient, and lacking folate makes it even worse. So you have higher homocysteine and higher cardiovascular dementia risk. But I've seen plenty of patients that have a double negative in that gene and have no increased homocysteine and no impact from it, because the variant is a susceptibility to inefficiency. You're not damned to it. Okay, so does that make sense? I've made a couple of videos about it before. If you search on my channel, MTHFR SNP, I walk you through it. But essentially, the genes, the genes are what we have. We can't change those, but their expression, epigenetics, is what really leads to your experience. So just because you have, another example is the BRCA1 gene in breast cancer. Hundreds of thousands of women in America have the BRCA1 gene. But if it were truly genetic, all of them should have breast cancer in their life. And that's not what we see. Some do, some don't. So some of them are turning that light switch on with poor lifestyle or living in a toxic environment or a combination of things, smoking and drinking and blah, blah, blah. And some women have that gene and it'll never be turned on. So it'll never be expressed and they'll never have breast cancer. So that's a genetic susceptibility, but the actual expression is epigenetic, and that's driven by choice or lifestyle or environment. And then the truly genetic diseases are like, hey, this person has Down syndrome, they have trisomy 21, they have an extra chromosome, or this person has cystic fibrosis, you know, that's a genetic disease. But only about 2.5% of diseases are truly genetic, where you have this gene, you have this disease. The others are epigenetic, where you have this gene providing the susceptibility, but whether it's turned on or off, expressed or unexpressed, determines on your lifestyle, your choices, the environment you're in, etc. So don't lose hope, Karen. And I'll actually share with you, I have this SNP. Where's my pen? So I have this one, but I don't have this one. And I don't have any pain, and my CRP is normal. So again, that doesn't, having it is just part of the recipe. And then other things determine whether this is going to end up in symptoms with me. And to Niraj's point earlier, hey, if I happen to unfortunately get in a major car accident that really hurt me and flared me up, would that be enough to turn this on? Possibly, hopefully not. But you know, there could be other, up to this point, I have this, and right now it's just there. Okay, and hopefully I never have some event that turns this on and leads me down this road. But another thing I've seen is with patients, when you do genetic testing, this is why we don't want to just run one gene, because I've seen God or nature or whatever you want to say often deals, you know, say good cards in the rest of the hand. So you might have this bad gene here, but then there's genes here, 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 and here that can inhibit this or make up for this in different ways. So just seeing this and me being like, crap, I'm screwed. I'm just going to eat pizza till I die. You know, I'm going to hurt anyway. It's if you zoom out and look at the whole puzzle, oftentimes you've been dealt something that, you know, makes up for it. Topic.
I just have a question because I don't understand that much about genetics. So all we really know from the testing is if you have a particular gene. The testing doesn't say you have this gene and it is, or I'm sorry, if you have a mutation of the gene or a SNP or a something, right? But so like in the example you gave of yourself that you have the SNP for the IL-6, but it's not on Like there's no testing that says it's on, right?
Right. So
It's just something you're considering in the big picture.
right. So if you have, he has these, and then you have to take this and compare it with labs and the rest of his clinical picture and say, there's a high probability that these are contributing in your case or in his case, right? But then with mine, you see this positive, and I don't have the pain, I don't have a chronic inflammatory disease, I don't have autoimmunity, so that's just a susceptibility, right? So the clinical context matters. This is why we can't treat paper, because if we saw this, or other times I've seen patients with MTHFR mutations, and a lot of doctors do that. They'll run an MTHFR on Emily and they'll be like, oh, she's heterozygous or she's homozygous, so she needs a ton of methylfolate for the rest of her life. And it's like, well, and you might take that and now you have anxiety and you've never had anxiety before. And it's like, well, that's because she doesn't have any methylation defects, even though she has those variants. And now you're providing too many methyl donors to her, which is now messing with her neurochemistry and driving anxiety. So it's just a part of the puzzle. It's there, and we need to look at the rest of the clinical context to understand, is that something we need to chase, or is it something we just remember and in the future, could return to if things change? And this is to Jarrell's question too, a little bit. This is like really new for in the health world, like SNPs, epigenetics basically started being talked about in 2006. So we've got 10, 15 years of research on this, and it's exploding and growing each day. But this report is totally different than ones I used to do 5, 10 years ago. So we're learning a lot here, and you can see here, this report even tells you the scientific rating. Okay, so this is saying of a possible, if we had 5 stars filled in blue here, that would be the strongest evidence. Like, we have the most scientific evidence behind these genes up to this point. So these two are 2 out of 5. So this is, we have some, there's science behind it, and it continues to build. But we're not 5 stars yet here, whereas like the MTHFR gene would have 5 stars filled out. So depending on, we're learning more about genes all the time, and as science grows and grows, we'll fill in more stars, and then we can more confidently say things about a given SNP. So just know it's fluid. We're always learning, and as we learn more, some things change. So we don't want to see a field of science like this that is relatively infant, only 15 years in, and take a result and just damn ourselves, and get depressed about it and say, well, screw it, I'm not going to work hard because this is here. Well, no, don't screw it, because we don't know. What we know is sufficient enough right now to say don't screw it, and likely the more we find out, the more we're going to know there's actionable things to do.